Alright, welcome to the channel. My name's James and today we're going to be covering part 2 of the Azrakh series. We're going to be painting the gold non-metallic trim, so let's get into it. Alright, we're going to be tackling the gold non-metallic trim on Azrakh. There's quite a bit of it across this model, so I've broken it down into some smaller sections, but you apply the same principles across the entire model. You'll need 4 paints for this. You'll need some burnt sienna umber, burnt sienna, yellow ochre and vanilla white. All the paints will be listed below in the description along with the Games Workshop equivalents. Alright, we're going to be starting off with some yellow ochre and some burnt sienna umber. We're going to use these two colours to sketch out the light placement across the model. We're going to be following all that light placement that we did during the red non-metallic, so it's quite easy to know where you're meant to place these colours. We're going to wet blend between the two colours to try and create something of a transition between them, but obviously we're going to come back later on and tidy that all up. So just do your best to place all lights in the correct place and place all the shadows in the correct places. Now as you work across the model, nothing here has to be perfect. Obviously we can move things and adjust things later on in the process, but this just helps to give you some context and gives you that additional information and confidence as you move forward with the process. So once you're done with this stage, you'll end up with something that looks a wee bit like this. You can see that the light positions all map the positions for our red non-metallics, so we're confident that everything's going to match up in the end. We're then going to take a mix of yellow ochre and vanilla white. We're going to use this to block in some of our more intense reflections, so really just picking out those brighter sections across the gold non-metallic. Now you just want to focus on the areas that are facing the light or perpendicular to the light source. You don't need to worry about anything that's in shadow at this point. Now speaking of those areas in shadow, it's almost like I planned this. We're going to block in some of these bounce lights. So we're going to be using burnt sienna and yellow ochre primarily for the bounce lights. Obviously the deepest shadows are going to be the burnt sienna umber. Using the burnt sienna, we're going to block in a majority of the area and really define the overall volume and shape. We're then going to basically dip our brush straight into our yellow ochre. We're not going to clean it first, and we're sort of doing this kind of loaded brush style approach to this, where we're essentially filling the body of the brush with the burnt sienna and then using the tip for the yellow ochre, and we're going to sort of feather out that transition to create a blend between the two colours. In order to add some more intensity and some more information into those areas, we're going to use some yellow ochre to pick out those edges and really help to define the different shapes. Now if there's certain areas where they're quite close to the light source or potentially going to be interacting with some light, you can add in some additional highlights of yellow ochre and vanilla white to help just really add some pop to those areas. Now when it comes to the small cylindrical tubes on the back of the legs, we're really going to try to paint these quite quickly, so we're just going to block in the underside with burnt sienna umber just so it's nice and dark, and then using some burnt sienna we're going to add in some bounce lights similar to how we did in those other places. If you're really wanting to push it, you can add in some additional highlights of burnt sienna and yellow ochre in those positions just to, help to add in some more variation and some more indication of the bounce light. We're then going to use the vanilla white to help add in those super bright highlights and really create that cylindrical reflection pattern across those sections. Using the burnt sienna, we're going to glaze that into certain sections just to help emphasize the shape of the volumes. And then with the burnt sienna umber, we're just going to add in some black lining effectively between the components. Alright, so we've kind of covered off all those wee fiddly bits. Most of your time is going to be spent painting things that look like this. And I like to start by smoothing out some of the transitions that I created whenever I was defining that light pattern across the model. So I'll start off with some yellow ochre just to help soften out that transition into the vanilla white. And then we'll take some burnt sienna to help soften out the transition into the burnt sienna umber. Now whenever I'm doing that, I'm kind of using that loaded brush technique. I'm not really cleaning my brush too much, that way I get a sort of mix of the paints within the brush, and it almost helps to soften the transitions on the fly and just makes things that wee bit easier. Once I'm happy with how the transitions look, I'm going to start using some of those brighter colours, that yellow ochre and vanilla white mix, and vanilla white to help block in and define those bright reflection points across the model and give some emphasis to the light map and those reflection points. Whenever you're doing this, you want to make sure you're thinking about the sections that are perpendicular to the light source, edges, things that are going to reflect the light or be slightly brighter. Anytime that I'm working in these areas and I'm not happy with the transition, I just jump back to my previous colours like the yellow ochre and just soften out those transitions. and then bounce back into the vanilla white and just help to re-emphasize the parts that are correct and really help pick out those edges and define the light. Now in the shadow sections, or the areas where there's going to be bounce light, I'm going to come in with burnt sienna, block in a lot of that light, use the burnt sienna umber again to soften out that transition, really work to smooth out those initial blends first, because then you can focus on the actual reflections. In order to do that, I kind of wet blend some yellow ochre and some burnt sienna together just on the model, and then sort of start to re-emphasize that with some yellow ochre. And again, whenever we're doing the bounce lights, we're not really pushing anything beyond the yellow ochre sort of burnt sienna mix stage. Now the tricky thing about this model is there's a number of complex shapes across the model, mainly the skulls in various sections. So you've got the skull on the shoulder, skull on the guns. You've got that skull on the knee and in the crotch as well. These are all quite complex shapes, and generally where you'll need to spend most of your time in order to make sure that the reflections and the highlights all match up with the rest of the model. So I thought it'd be useful if I spent a bit more time on those areas. So just like all those other sections, I initially start off by trying to smooth out my transitions and refine my light map. I'm doing this by, either wet blending or using that loaded brush technique just to help create those transitions and create those intermediate colors within the model. Now generally whenever you're working with very complex shapes, you want to try and break them down into somewhat like of a simple form. So for me, the skull's kind of like a bit of a sphere because where it's positioned on the shoulder and the fact it's got that curvature with a couple of sharp edges that would indicate the detail within the skull. So I've placed the sort of brightest reflection point towards the left side of the top of the skull as we look at it, and then the forehead kind of thing, because it was like this big open space. I decided to sort of treat that a bit more of a like flat surface, kind of do that rule of cool, have the light sort of cascading across it, and then using bright highlights to distinguish the different like orbital bones, the nose, the teeth, and so on. If you're enjoying the video so far, don't forget to hit that like. It really helps to promote the video and helps the channel grow. And if you're feeling frisky, don't forget to give that subscribe a wee slap and a tickle. You can also drop a comment below to help please the algorithm. And again, whenever I'm working on this section of the knee, I'm trying to think about what are the core shapes in here and how do I break this down into its most simple form. So I'm treating the top section of the skull very much like a sphere. So I've got this bright highlight over towards the right top side of the knee, and then I'm starting to create this shadowed section towards the left bottom side of the knee, and starting that in those mid-tones to help bridge the gap between the two. As you go lower down on the model towards the teeth and towards the jaw and the orbital bones, I'm sort of treating it somewhat like a cylinder, just because of the way it wraps around the shin pad or the lower armor of the leg. I'm not worrying about the chaos symbol in the middle of the knee at the minute. It's pretty much just being absorbed into that spherical shape until I've defined all of the light and really created that shape and structure within this component. So you'll see I'm adding in those shadow colors in exactly the same places, not worrying about those individual shapes just yet. When it comes to the teeth, I'm adding in the brightest highlights or the specular highlights in the sections that are like perpendicular to the light source. So remember in the first video we talked about our light coming from pretty much above the model, or a wee bit in front but above the model. So it's just what sections of the teeth are going to be illuminated by that, and then also thinking about what sections are in shadow. And it's kind of the same with some of those orbital bones, really just grabbing the sharpest points within those where the light is going to be brightest, or at least appear very bright whenever it's reflected back at us. Now once we've clearly defined the brightest points within each of those individual shapes that create that more complex shape, I'm starting to refine that by bringing in more of those vanilla whites and vanilla white yellow ochre mixes to really refine the lighting patterns, starting to smooth out those transitions and emphasize some of those different shapes. Also maybe taking some liberties by adding in some rule of cool or some more interesting reflection patterns that just help to emphasize the shape of the different components. And whenever I'm doing this, I'm constantly going back and forth to different mixes or adjusting the lighting to ensure that it looks right to my eye. So every time I'm making a change, I'm always trying to observe the difference, look at it from afar, bring it close, and try to understand whether or not it's actually working to create the effect that you want. So now I've painted in all of the lights, I really need to focus on creating a bit more roundness to certain sections. Like I said earlier, I was treating the top of the knee very much like a sphere, so I need to try and reinforce that spherical shape, or at least that roundness in those sections by adding in the bounce lights to effectively what would be the underside of the sphere. Working with that burnt sienna and yellow ochre mix, we're sort of mixing them on the model in the brush to try and smooth out those transitions and really reinforce the shape. And you can start to see how it's coming together with those brighter highlights, and then we have that dark section where effectively we have that sort of termination of our light and then up into the bright sections. Also adding in some more contrast underneath the orbital bone or underneath the brow bone, just to help create more shape and more structure, and also reinforce those reflections and highlights. And again, you can see I'm going back and forth to it, I'm smoothing it out. Obviously, the more time that you spend refining your highlights, refining your bounce lights, will help to improve the contrast and overall effectiveness of your non-metallics. So a top tip whenever you're painting non-metallics is to either switch your camera into black and white mode, or take a photo of it and switch it over into black and white. You'll be able to see whether or not your contrast is right to create that reflection and that shine. But you can see a lot of our high value colors all match up to where they are within the red, and you really get that emphasis of light and reflection across the entirety of the model. Let's get them on the spinny thing and have a proper look. So you can see those super warm tones from the burnt sienna as we transition from the yellow ochre into the burnt sienna umber. I think that really helps to add warmth, interest and detail within our gold. Plus it helps to give you a nice hue shift into those bounce lights and into those shadowed sections as well. Also, by having those super warm colors within our gold, it almost helps to add some coldness back into the reds and into the shadows across the various sections of the model. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you have any comments, questions or suggestions for future videos, please drop them below in the comments. And if you want to show me what you've been working on, head on over to the Discord and drop some pics into the whips or the completed projects. I'd love to see what you've been painting. If you'd like to get some personalised coaching and tuition, head on over to the Patreon and check out the available packages. There'll be something there to suit everybody. All links can be found below in the description. Thank you again for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll catch you at the next one.